Good morning, everybody, and I'd also pay my respects to the traditional owners. I'm going to get the average up in terms of slides on PowerPoints. So I'll take you quite quickly through a range of issues. I want to briefly talk about the Scanlon Foundation surveys, Index of Social Cohesion and what that's doing, attitudes to government, then a whole range of issues in the immigration, asylum, multicultural space. Spend about 1 minute on generations. And the main focus, or certainly half the focus, is on challenges. So the Scanlon Foundation surveys, it's quite remarkable given the significance of immigration that prior to the investment in this space of the Scanlon Foundation, we did not have systematic data. It was not quite that grey wall, but it was close to that. It was grey wall with lights coming through, but nothing systematic. And that's an indication of systematic. It's a graph which plots sense of identification amongst the overseas born by length of residence in Australia. So there's now been, we're actually on to the 9th annual survey, which is currently completing its fieldwork. We've done local surveys, we've done experimental surveys just to understand better the impact of surveying methodologies on outcomes, and different methodologies produce different results. Interviewer administered, self-administered, big differences with a number of questions, not on all issues. We've now got like a total database of something like 35,000 respondents, so quite a lot of data. We've got detailed questionnaires, we can track shifts of opinion, we understand how questions are answered, and it's probably more important to understand how questions are answered rather than the raw numbers. And we've got samples of sufficient size to understand subgroups. Again, you need to understand subgroups if you're going to have predictability. Flat data doesn't tell you all that much. So with regard to the Index of Social Cohesion, we've got 5 domains that we look at: belonging, worth, social justice and equity, participation, particularly in the political system, and the extent to which immigration is accepted or rejected. And what we've seen is relative stability in that index, except for one major decline in the context of perceived failures of the Rudd government, failure to deliver on undertakings and promises, and also in the context of the global financial crisis. And where that index is picking up greatest movement is in the index of acceptance or rejection. Interestingly, in the last period of the Abbott government, the index went up, which was contrary to the interpretations of what was happening in the Australian political space, say, in the media. One area where we're seeing some movement is a feeling of inequity, that the gap between incomes is too large in this society. If we look at attitudes to government, Australians, according to a number of commentators, are a nation of cynics. We don't have a great deal of trust in government, and that trust, which went up in that first period of the Rudd government, collapsed and really hasn't recovered. When we ask respondents about asking to rank institutions, organisations, medical profession, police, the courts, relatively highly ranked. But then when we look at employers, trade unions, federal parliament, political parties, and political parties in our surveying are down near the bottom. And this is a fairly consistent result. When we ask immigrants to rank institutions, the ranks are pretty much the same, but higher at the bottom end. So it takes immigrants about 10 years or 15 years to come up to speed with regard to Australian attitudes. Ranking of issues, when we ask in an open-ended question, what are the most important issues? It almost always will be the economy. The most recent trends that we were picking up, this is between 2014 and 2015, was increasing concern over terrorism, national security issues. It'd be quite interesting to see, what's happened in the last 12 months, and those results will be released late November. End of this month, we're releasing the results of our online survey with 10,000 participants and 50 focus groups. And I'll be giving you an insight into some of that focus group findings in a minute. With regard to immigration, interestingly, Australians are relatively positive with regard to immigration, and I've continued to be surprised the way that relative positivity has held up. Each time I look at the data, I expect that it will shift. But it really hasn't shifted. It's sort of like 40-60, 40-55, that sort of number, with the 55 more positive than negative towards immigration. And what's interesting about that number is that this is a question that moves. Some questions hardly move at all from one to the next. And you can see that it's an index it was a question that produced considerable volatility going back to the 1970s, 80s, in the recession of the early 90s. It's been relatively stable over the last 15 years and hasn't shifted upwards in the last 5 years. And it's not just the Scandon Foundation surveying somehow getting it wrong, because if we compare a couple of other surveys, the ANU poll or the Lowy Institute poll, which has just come out, they're getting similar numbers or even more favourable numbers. With regard to asylum policy, my interpretation is that in general there's very low level of acceptance of boat arrivals. And this is something that's not unique to the third generation Australians. It's as strong or stronger amongst immigrant communities where we've got insights. So when we give people these 4 options, should there be an opportunity for permanent residence as opposed to turning back boats and positions in between, relatively stable. And the proportion who think that if you come by boat, you should be able to gain permanent residence, it's about 20 to 25% on this data. There are other interpretations, but that's my interpretation of this data. And the trend has been to greater negativity. There's only one subgroup where you will get majority support for the right of permanent residence if you come by boat, and we look at about 30 different variables. The one group is intending to vote Greens, where 70% or more will agree that if you come by boat, you should be able to gain permanent residence. There's some differences by the states, but you don't get like majority support for boat arrivals anywhere. As you can see, like Victoria, the highest positivity, Queensland, Western Australia, the lowest. No great surprises there. With regard to multiculturalism, the interesting finding in Australia is that multiculturalism is still a very strong brand. If you ask people, has it been good for Australia or not, you're getting this remarkable figure of around 85%. And as Tim Soutphommasane has said in one of the discussions that we've had, very hard to find that level of positive sentiment with regard to any policy setting. But then you've got to go further, because the tendency is, all right, that's it, put it in the bag, let's move on. Don't move on, look at it more closely. So you get that 85% figure by half the people strongly agreeing that it's been good for Australia, half agreeing. And that half who agree, it's not a really strong number. Again, some differences in states, similar patterns as before. Melbourne at one end, Canberra if we want to put that in. But when we've analysed it more closely, you get about 20 to 25% strong believers in pluralism, about 40%, the largest grouping, who think there should be two-way movement, not that Australians will become more like the immigrants, not that we'll have a whole range of cultures, but that we should all move in one direction, and that direction is Australia changes, but mainstream gets to better understand immigrants adapt to Australian society. And that assimilationist position that Australians don't change, immigrants are going to become like us or get out, it's about 20 to 5%. All right, if we now look at generational change, and I'm just going to make one point here, that on some issues there's no difference when we analyse data by age group. Nobody trusts politicians. With regard to multiculturalism, high across the board, but highest amongst the youngest age group, that's the 18 to 29 at the bottom. We should learn more about the customs and heritage of different groups. More of a marked difference there than amongst the 60 to 69 year age. And then whether governments should be in the business of supporting cultural maintenance, you can see a big difference there on that sort of issue between young and elderly. All right, current issues and challenges. And now I'm drawing on the latest survey, and particularly the 50 focus groups that we conducted in Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne and Perth. And these were conducted with third-generation Australians and then specific immigrant groups, Chinese, Indians, New Zealanders. And you get a different picture once you start to go to the macro. And George, you were giving us the big picture. Immigrants settle in the inner urban areas. A lot of them don't. A lot of them are struggling. And this comes out very strongly in the focus group discussions. And when we compare data where it is comparable across time, like I can compare 2013 and 2015 where we did online surveys, it's not better. The data seems to be becoming more negative rather than more positive. So 4 challenges. Segmentation of the population. And the segmentation is not just urban-rural. Very significant segmentation in the cities. People socialised in a multicultural area, people socialised in monocultural Australia. And structures working to keep the groups apart, such as our school system. Amongst the mainstream population, say second, third generation Australians, you get one group, as I indicated before, who very strongly embrace change, but another group who think the worst thing that's happening in Australia is large-scale immigration. And they're not minute. When we ask what's the worst thing about life in Australia, close to 20% of third-generation Australians, or Australian-born, close to 30%, said the worst thing about Australia is that there's too much immigration. So that Pauline Hanson phenomenon and allied phenomena, it's very clear in the data. It was clear 20 years ago, it's clear today, it hasn't gone away. Visa categories. With regard to some of the visa categories, there's issues. For example, and here what I'm saying is, could we be doing better? This is my point. Could we be doing better? With 1 or 2% extra effort, could we actually be making a significant difference? And there's one issue that comes out in the focus groups, independent skilled visa category. You don't get any help when you most need it. That is when you arrive in Australia. As one participant explained, you actually get help when you don't need it, after you've been here in the country for 2 years, but you most need it when you arrive. There's big issues with the New Zealand special category visa entrants. There are about 200,000 of them in Australia who are second-class citizens. And they know it. They know it. The most disenchanted group in our current surveying are New Zealanders. And asylum seekers. I think most of you know the situation. There are about close to 30,000, who arrived before the cut-off point. So they didn't end up in Nauru. They didn't end up offshore. They're here, but they're having great difficulties. They can't even get an answer to questions. It's almost Kafkaesque. I had a student working in this area, working in an agency, trying to understand what was going on, and I said, and loving Australia. And there's issues, with local areas of settlement, areas of large population concentration, such as, these are areas on the periphery of major cities where there's large numbers of immigrants, or in the middle range, like Logan and Inala in Brisbane. What makes a difference? People say it's local government can make a big difference, voluntary agencies can make a big difference, and schools can make a huge difference, leadership in schools. And we've got a system where it seems from the discussions, so dependent on the principal. The principal drives the school in one direction, sets discipline, sets standards, and in a neighbouring school it's totally different. So there's an issue there. If you agree that it's so dependent on the principal, what is it possible to do? So the key points really were that integration is always difficult, always challenging. I talked about the social context of Australian attitudes, relatively positive, but divided. There's a great optimism, which I haven't talked about, of immigrants. Immigrants are much more positive about Australia in their first 5 years than in the second 5 years. Immigrants come with great optimism, how to harness that to the best. Strong sense in this country of belonging, social justice. Question, scope to do better. Scope to do better at the 1 or 2% level, which actually makes a huge difference in outcomes. Thank you.